Alrighty, welcome everyone. Can everybody hear me back there? To coming to our session, we know it's super late in the meeting and some of you don't even know what we're going to talk about, so this is doubly exciting. So my name's Andra Blomkalns. I'm currently the chair at Stanford. I recently moved from UT Southwestern in Dallas, where I was vice chair there and also part of the Office for Technology Development. And go ahead, Jeremy.
And I'm Jeremy Ackerman. I'm an associate professor at Emory. I also have a faculty appointment in biomedical engineering at Georgia Tech. I run a kind of large-scale clinical immersion program where we work with engineering students to teach engineering students how to actually build the next generations of devices for us.
So Jeremy and I met because of a common interest, this common interest a couple years ago, and thought that emergency medicine is particularly adept at sort of doing things and inventing things. So we thought this would be a worthwhile discussion to talk about at the annual meeting. We have no relevant disclosures other than what he's mentioned. So depending on your age group, which MacGyver actually is the MacGyver that you know, emergency medicine is so great at figuring out what we need to do with the supplies we have versus supplies we don't have. And that's why I feel like particularly emergency physicians have the predilection to either test, develop, or make new devices. Perhaps in your minds you have an idea of what you may have used or done before when you had to create something new or different in the emergency department, whether that was, you know, finagling a central line kit or doing something different with a Foley catheter or otherwise. So think about those things, and the goal of this presentation is to talk to you about how you can capture those ideas and potentially move them forward. All right, so our objectives are, one, to talk a little bit about how to create an environment where you can brainstorm a clinically relevant idea and perhaps a solution. We'll also talk a little bit about intellectual property, patents, disclosures, and that process and how people get started in terms of developing a new device.
So a medical device really is an instrument that we use either diagnostically or therapeutically as part of care. You know, we've got a definition that the FDA gives us, which certainly is important. And one of the reasons for a talk like this to define what it means is that as we start thinking about devices, if you are talking about developing a medical device, you immediately really should be thinking about how the markets work, how you get to an approval, and how you get your idea actually out there. So it's important to think about what we actually mean when we talk about a medical device.
So these are some examples of some recent sort of emergency medicine applicable devices. You may have used some of them, you may have not used some of them. A great deal of iPhone adaptable devices, as you might imagine. Lots of scopes, and I even see residents and faculty going, wouldn't it be great if we could add this to a scope? Chances are, if it's with an iPhone, it's already been done. But nonetheless, that's an example of an ophthalmoscope. And also, but think about, devices don't have to be complicated, they don't have to be mechanical. They can actually be pieces of plastic essentially put together. There's irrigation, bionics has sort of developed irrigation of just about everything, ears and otherwise in wounds. The reactor is a chest tube insertion kit, and Dermabond is even a device, and came after the camping folks noticed that they could glue their wounds together with super glue, and so essentially all Dermabond is pigmented cyanoacrylate, which is essentially super glue, but now it's a medical device.
So among the trends that we're seeing is, although we have some devices that are sort of like some of these examples where it's a standalone device, much of what we're seeing in the medical device industry are things where we're taking multiple previous devices, combining them in new ways, adding features like connectivity to our medical record systems and other wireless things, wearable devices, and there's a large growth area in things like home and personal health. So we have a picture here of an insulin pump, which is one of those things that in our residents' education, increasingly we have to teach them about some of these devices simply because our patients come in with them. But that also creates an opportunity to see how real-world devices that patients actually use are out there and perhaps develop some inspiration for creating devices of our own. So when we think about these devices, the big thing that we're looking for is there actually a clinical need? All right? Is there something there that's going to benefit a healthcare system? Is there something that we can target in terms of a disease process or one of our interventions that's likely going to help us? Is there a good risk-benefit ratio? Certainly one of the problems that we sometimes encounter with devices is the device that sometimes works, and that's great when it works, but when it doesn't work, it creates a problem that's even worse. In all of this, part of the consideration is who is ultimately going to be paying for this. Is there enough of a benefit here that somebody's going to buy it and it becomes worth this effort that's going to be needed in order to develop the product and move it forwards towards market? I don't remember what we were going to say about this. Some more great examples. I know, Schnozzle, they've been one of the exhibitors here at SAEM. Many of these things came out of needs that people recognized over the course of clinical care, where we needed a sprayer that was specifically designed to spray up somebody's nose or to irrigate an eye rather than just sort of MacGyvering things all the time. And these are devices that are remarkably simple. There's not much to it. There's a nozzle and a screw thread, and that's about it. And yet these are things that, there's a company that actually sells these things and has continued to be able to make a profit on it. Not huge profits, but certainly enough that they're still here, and it certainly makes our lives a little bit easier.
Oops, wrong direction, sorry. I turned it upside down. Okay, intellectual property. So that's a term that's commonly used, and there's some buzzwords that are used in this industry: intellectual property, FDA certification, patents, and those are the things we wanted to cover because they actually mean some things different than what intuition might believe. So basically intellectual property is anything that you thought of through your intellectual effort. Intellectual property can belong, depending on where you are in an institution, either to you alone or the institution completely, or some combination of the two. And it's worthwhile finding out what your institution's policies are on this. For instance, UT Southwestern had a very generous intellectual property policy where most of proceeds would go back to the inventor, whereas some institutions, the institution owns it. If it has anything to do with your day-to-day work, like if you invent a new violin, it's unlikely that Stanford's going to be interested in me marketing that violin, or them marketing that violin. But if it has something to do with emergency medicine, they are interested in that intellectual property. One thing is people, I think, the first time I read something like this, I was like, no way, they're not going to get my idea. I'm not going to tell them. I didn't really say that out loud, but that's what I'm thinking in my head, and I think a lot of people have that dialogue in the back of their brain regarding whether or not to disclose intellectual property. But in reality, it's to your benefit to disclose it because they have the connections and deeper pocketbooks in regard to being able to get patents and so forth.
Yeah, to echo that, I have several inventions and I've spent nothing on patent attorneys, and yet I've had my institutions pay several hundreds of thousands of dollars to actually get patents submitted and ultimately issued. That's money that I am not spending. That is time that I am not spending as an inventor. Which doesn't necessarily mean that we're ever going to make any money on it, and that's the reality of patents, is most patents actually never turn a profit. So it is one of those things to think about when you think you've got a great idea, is you may actually find it's actually highly advantageous, even if it doesn't look like the intellectual property policy is all that great.
Yeah, I mean, I have a colleague specifically who left clinical medicine altogether to start a company based on something he really believed in. And it's now about 12 years later, and he's just now going to market in a real way. But it takes extraordinary commitment if you don't want to do it on behalf of or with your university. So a patent, a lot of people think when you're inventing something that getting a patent is a wonderful goal. It is a goal. But basically what you're doing with a patent is you're disclosing your information to the rest of the universe. And you have to disclose every last bit, how it's built, how it's constructed, what it's made of, lots of drawings and all those things, because the original reason for patenting was to get new information out there. So people didn't find out years later. So while the patent in some ways is protective of somebody doing exactly the same thing, its actual purpose is to be able to have information out on the new things that are being invented.
The other portion that's really important to understand about patents is a patent, if I have a patent on my idea, it does not mean that I necessarily can go to market with that idea. Right? What it gives me is the exclusive right to use that specific idea, but what you find particularly in medical devices, these are complicated things with multiple ideas encompassed within a single invention. And you may find yourself in a situation where you've got an idea, but in order to do that, you've got to use somebody else's patent. And so you may, in fact, not necessarily be able to actually go to market with the portion of your idea that's new. So this gets into an area of law and business that can be very, very complicated. But it's kind of important to understand that it doesn't mean that you can move forward. It does mean you can sue somebody who is using your idea, but you may not have a pathway to use your idea by yourself.
And it's also the responsibility of the patent's owner to police whether or not the patent is being encroached upon. So you can imagine as an individual, if you had a patent, just the sheer energy of trying to find out if anybody's encroaching upon it is incredibly arduous and almost not even possible, which is why divisions of companies have exactly that. They have people or divisions of people who actually comb through the internet and try to find patent encroachments. Inventorship. I think we'll skip that. You're up again.
All right, so this is a good example of a complex invention that at some level is sort of simple, and I don't remember the name of this product.
XStat.
XStat. So the basic idea is that you've got these small little expanding particles that have hemostatic agents in it, which by themselves may not be very functional, but you add it to something that allows you to inject it with some degree of pressure into a wound, and suddenly you're able to fill a cavity with a hemostatic agent and actually form clotting. So if you think about it, there are multiple components, right? We've got an injection device, we've got that mechanism for putting these things, we might have the material of these expanding particles as well as the hemostatic agent, and then on top of that there would be a patent of how we combine all of those things together into that device that's over there. All right? And if somebody else holds the patent for any one of those components and the patent is still in place, you may not be able to bring your larger device to market.
Right, and one thing we didn't mention before is a patent is an actual piece of property. It can be sold, it can be willed, it's actually something that you can potentially sell after you think of an idea and get it patented, and that's it. That could be the end of what you want to do with it. So it's an interesting piece of legislation. This is also called a combination device, and that's when they combine a medical device and a pharmaceutical together. This is, everyone knows what this is. This is a rhino rocket, right? And once again, we're giving examples of how in emergency medicine, it's really, really easy to conceive perhaps on a daily clinical shift where you might contrive of something that might be useful. This is what the patent looks like for a similar rhino rocket. A patent protects that invention for 20 years. There are lots of renewal fees and things that happen along with that. But this is just an example of what a patent looks like and the sort of things that are in that information in regard to schematics and drawings and otherwise. So FDA. So we have the intellectual property. We talked about patents. And now the FDA. So the FDA is an interesting thing. They are responsible for allowing essentially marketing of a device. It's not a stipulation of whether or not you can use a device. FDA approval allows you to market it. So there are 3 different classifications of devices. A simple one like a toothbrush or even gauze is like a class 1 device, whereas a class 3 device can be some of the more complicated things that involve mechanics or otherwise. And there are different regulatory pathways depending on what your device is and whether or not there's something like it already out there, and that's called a predicate device.
So commercialization is ultimately where most of us want to go with our inventions. And that's because we don't just want to have a patent and have it sit on a shelf. Most of us who come up with ideas would like to be able to use our own devices and also ideally have other people maybe even get them to, pay you a little bit of money and make a profit off of it. So commercialization often is going to start out with a license agreement that is giving permission to use the intellectual property within a patent, right? If that's something that you're starting your own company, in fact, you may not need to have a formal license agreement if you hold the patent. But if, for example, your university holds the patent and you start a company, you may need to license that intellectual property from the university. That license is sort of the first step. It's usually a fairly convoluted process through the board of the university. For those of you that are faculty, you should be aware that you cannot be directly involved with the negotiation. It has to be done at a little bit of an arm's length. In general, these licenses, the university is going to seek to at least recoup all the costs of getting the patents, and then they're going to be looking to get additional proceeds, whether that's a portion of the company, a royalty fee, or some other schedule of things. And that becomes very important if you're interested in starting a company yourself, to understand what all of those terms mean and how that would impact your company in the long run. If instead you find an existing company that's out there that's interested in your idea, often you find yourself in the situation where you'd like your university to negotiate and be very aggressive about that, because the profits you're going to see out of your license are going to come through based on the profits that the university gets.
And that's where the agreement of your university talks about the profit sharing agreement. And in general, the first says, okay, first we need to recoup all our costs that we dedicated to this, and then there's generally some revenue sharing arrangement. So these are just another couple examples, the iGel and lots and lots and lots of stuff in airway equipment. Airway is very of a saturated market. These things, Smarty Pants, I just thought it was kind of a funny name, but nonetheless, it actually provides electric stimulation to prevent bed sores in people. So just kind of interesting things. It stimulates the muscles so that they don't develop pressure sores. So other than medical professionals, who do you feel might be the most inventive profession? You can name one or two. Engineers? Well, that's kind of I suppose, sort of a given, but there's two discrete things. Golfers, apparently, have a ton of patents, and fishermen. So, just one of those weird things.
So a few more examples of devices, and again, a lot of what you should be seeing in these devices is, although when you get handed an easy I/O and you go, oh yeah, we're going to put in an I/O that's so much easier than the old school ones that we put in, at the end of the day, this is essentially a combination of an I/O and a drill, right? It's not really much more complicated than that. Combination of an iPhone with a lens system or adding a camera into a laryngoscope. These are all combination things where you can sit back and say, what was the problem that somebody had here? What was the challenge with the I/O? Why were they having trouble looking in ears? What's our challenge with airway? That would then lead to a thought process in this invention.
A key part of this is identifying and being able to really describe the problem that's associated that needs to be solved. Rather than necessarily thinking of the device, because the device, you can actually get help of people to help you put together a device, but it's more or less what is the issue at hand that needs to be solved, and you can imagine what these issues are. So in the endoscopy market, for instance, there was a bunch of the sterilization problems. I was down about a year ago where a bunch of people were being scoped with contaminated devices. Huge rush now, disposable devices. So there are disposable endoscopy equipment, disposable airway equipment, all of that just because the sterilization, the universe saw a need for it, and the sterilization was getting too expensive. This is just another interesting thing about things that become medical devices. This went through the accelerated 510K pathway, but it's honey. It's honey on a piece of gauze. We may have heard that honey is a good bacteriostatic, but someone put this together with specifically Manuka honey on a piece of gauze and marketed it and sold it.
All right, so this sort of shows sort of the pathway through product development, and the y-axis here is the profit loss sort of thing. So when you start out and you're just getting started thinking about an idea, you haven't spent any money on it, so you're value neutral. As you start developing and working on, obviously, at a minimum, you're investing your time and effort. But at some point, particularly if it's an idea that appears to have potential, you or somebody needs to start putting actual money into developing it and trying to do the research, the development, in the case of a medical device, potentially even things like clinical trials. And that poses a challenge because somewhere around here, things get to be a little bit more expensive than you're reasonably going to pay for out of your own pocket. And so in this commercialization phase, there's this phase known as the Valley of Death, which is something as a potential inventor you really should just be aware of from the get-go, that at some point things will become expensive enough that if you're not able to get investors, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how great your product is, if there's no more money, the product is going to be dead. And so part of the challenge is early on to have a well enough defined sense of what the problem is you're solving and how to start incrementally chipping away at the risk so that investors will actually start to say, yes, this is a product I can get behind. I will pay for that next step, say the clinical trial, to further understand what the risks are and hopefully get across this gap.
So I was recently talking to a venture capitalist who I was like, how many ideas do you actually fund a year? And he said, about 100. And I was like, well, gosh, that seems awesome. And but that's out of evaluating 10,000. So venture capitalists and funders in general want to minimize risk and maximize gain, and they are willing to lose as long as they win big on some products. But I don't think we talked about investment. No, not yet.
No.
So the initial investor in any device is yourself or your friends or your family. Or the third or fourth F is fools, but that's a late person's nomenclature in regard to that. But then there's things called angel investors, and those are investors who will invest in a relatively small amount of capital in high-risk ventures. And then you move up as you go through Series A, Series B, Series C funding, and that gets larger and larger. Prototyping. So I'll say at UT Southwestern, when I was in the Office for Technology Development, we got tons of ideas every month from the clinical arena. Where a lot of things faltered was generating a prototype. One way to generate a prototype is to work with your local university or local engineering school or like local biodesign type school where the students need projects and a mentor to do it, and the students are very, very motivated because they're actually in class and they get graded for this, and they can help build a prototype. So I worked with the mechanical and biomedical engineering schools at University of Texas who made a lot of these initial prototypes. You can also hire somebody to make that prototype.
Before we go on, one of the other things to bear in mind with prototypes is when you work with the 3D printing, when you work with students at the university, often you're working towards getting fairly sophisticated prototypes. When I work with student teams, I'll encourage them to spend a lot of time with pieces of paper, cardboard, clay, Lego, random things, and very rapidly build not full-scale working prototypes, but just enough to get a sense of how the thing would work, how it would be like to use it. And so starting with very inexpensive, sort of cheap prototypes is actually a really good way to very efficiently start to flesh out some of the parameters about how your device should be designed and also start to understand whether this is actually going to be something that's useful.
So a lot of people go first in mind to a 3D printer. And the 3D printers are great. 3D printers are advancing tremendously quickly. You can even buy one for your home, not that expensively. But 3D printers are tricky. Who in here has used a 3D printer? You've had it? Yeah. With a little minor maladjustment, you can show up to your office or otherwise with a pile of like melted plastic and stuff if you're not careful. But in general, 3D printers are getting better, but that doesn't have to be the immediate answer or the immediate go-to thing. I think what you were saying in terms of inexpensive equipment and just putting it together, and then if you want to 3D print it, you can actually purchase those services relatively inexpensively and not have to waste a lot of time yourself doing it.
So this is actually a company that I've been involved with that came out of work that I did as a graduate student. And in terms of prototyping, much of our early prototyping actually was exactly this. So this is a picture that was part of my PhD dissertation that's still on the company's website. We had a notion of using augmented reality to assist laparoscopic surgery. We had a vision of how it would work, and it's amazing. I finished my dissertation in 2002, and so we're like 17 years later. A picture from that original sort of concept prototype is still something that's used as part of how they explain what their products are and what they do. So getting good visualization is a great thing. But over time, particularly if you use drawings and sort of low fidelity things, as you understand the problem better, originally we were just doing laparoscopic surgery. Where the company has moved is using things like ultrasound intraoperatively. So this ultrasound machine got added to the picture as we understood what the actual business potential was of our products.
So there is a spectrum that goes along with medical devices in terms of not simply making it, but generally these are all the types of companies that can be involved with an individual medical device. So you have the people who make the components, just the pieces, the plastic and otherwise, the people who actually put those components together, the device maker. A big part of device development is the marketing. And then we get into our sector, healthcare providers and insurers. So specifically, it's difficult to move forward with a device if you can't find something that necessarily insurance might be interested in paying for. But think also of the Apple Watch and its AFib application that it's on there. It's actually a medical device that managed to modify its application such that it didn't have to necessarily be paid for by insurers. Some insurers do pay for somebody to have an Apple Watch, but nonetheless, some people just want that information and will pay for it themselves.
This is another example of a product that I've gotten into, and we're sort of in a new era of doing device development. So I was working with a group of students on light fixtures for clinical settings, and we decided to form a company, and we couldn't find any investors. So what did? We started a Kickstarter campaign. And we actually ran 4 Kickstarter campaigns, 2 of which were successful, and brought in a total of about $16,000. In doing that, actually, in being successful, convinced the university to file a patent application, which then we started thinking about how to license our patent back from the university and discovered that was a bit of a problem for our very small company. But yet it started developing some of the intellectual property in a way that, 10 years ago we would have said, no, you have to find an investor. There are now these other pathways if you can find applications of your idea, maybe that are not so medical, maybe that are direct sales to a customer, maybe just gadgets that people think are cool. So this Gimbal 2.0 basically was a thing that would hold, I'm blanking on what they're called, the small video camera?
GoPro.
Yeah, a GoPro. So this is a device that basically you can put a GoPro in and you could throw it up in a tree and then use a remote control to aim your GoPro however you want, or mount a GoPro on somebody's helmet. So we sold that on Kickstarter for $50 a piece. We 3D printed everything that we sold. We delivered, and we turned a couple $1,000s profit here or there that allowed us to buy additional 3D printers and other things like that to help try to bring the product forward.
There are actually a lot of these Kickstarter type companies or crowdsourcing type companies, and people do follow it, and so do big time investors too, because they're looking for products that they might be able to invest in a big way. So in summary, what we wanted you to know is, one, know the policy of your university. Your university has a website specifically on this and what the regulations are specifically for any of your intellectual property. Before you invest too much time in what you're doing, just look through Google Patents and put in some keywords, because it is very possible, and I've seen several teams work on something for a long time and not realize that exactly what they came up with has already been invented. Look into different prototyping options. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be a 3D printer. It can be fairly simple initially and then get more complicated later. And then understand that funding has multiple mechanisms, starting with yourself, crowdsourcing, and then moving to bigger funders. So we very much appreciate your time, and we'll be happy to answer questions. Yes, sir.
Do you need us mic'd?
I'll just repeat your question. That's
okay. I have a bunch of patents, not very successful. Could you talk about public disclosure? Because people come to these meetings, do a public disclosure, even though they don't know they're doing it, and that has an implication on the patent.
Yes.
Which you may want to do just so nobody can ever patent it, but you may not want to do because you may not be able to patent it.
Right, and so so what he's talking about, that when you put something up at a meeting such as this, and more commonly in the advent of YouTube, people love to put their stuff on YouTube, that's considered a public disclosure. And once something is publicly disclosed as an idea, you have 1 year to file a patent on that specific device. So that's something a lot of people don't realize, and I'm very happy that you brought that up specifically, because that is something that particularly new inventors get in trouble with, because they very eagerly want to show what they're doing and put it up there or show it out in a meeting such as this. But there may be reasons why a patent isn't necessary to commercialize a product. So there are good reasons to get patents and bad reasons to get patents, but a lot of devices that you'll see in purchase say patent pending. And that just means there might be a perpetual application in the system that never actually gets successfully approved or filed. So.
Another issue with public disclosures, and particularly for those of us at universities, we've mentioned working with students. A lot of the students you work with are doing their development for you as part of a class, often with a public exhibition at the end. And so that's one of those things that when you start saying, hey, I want to work with a group of students, make sure you understand when their presentations are. If you're concerned that there is something that is your intellectual property, that either you have them not disclose it, or you make sure that things like a provisional patent or even a full patent application are already in the process before doing that. I guess the other issue with working with students that many of us run into is just because you have an idea and you're like, hey, we should do this thing, if the students are the ones who figure out how to actually do it, you may find yourself in a situation where you are not actually legally the inventor, right? If you said, I have this problem and you should have something sort of like this, and then the students figure out how to actually do something like this, there's a legal requirement of participating in the inventive step. And in many instances, clinical folks working with engineers don't always participate in that inventive step. And so it's very important to talk to your intellectual property office and figure out whether or not you actually are an inventor, or whether you're sort of handing the students a great idea where they discover the invention. I've actually worked that backwards, where I've had students that I felt confident that they were going to do some business competitions and other things, and they were more likely to successfully start a company and get funding than I am, because I see patients and go back to teaching and all of that. And so I've had times in working with a student where I realize they are about to solve the problem. And I'll say, you know what, I'm going to leave you in this room. Call me in 20 minutes when you work out the next step. All right? And part of why I do that is I don't necessarily want the university to be jumping in. If it's my idea, the university owns it, even if the students also participated in it. So I've had a couple of times where I've stepped back from a team and said, you're like this close to something really important, figure it out, write it down, put that date and time on it, file your provisional patent, and then let's talk again. And I've had some teams that, I now have teams that have made about $2.5 million in investments, and some of them were ones where I knew they were close to something important, and I actually stepped away from them to give them that freedom away from the control of the university.
So students, because they pay tuition for this, they actually are independent contractors and are not under the university stuff necessarily. So while if you work for the university, that matters. As a student, as long as you're paying tuition, it's considered your own gig, so you can do essentially whatever you want. Oh, the other thing with public disclosure, so in times where I've worked with students and student teams, the school or organization at the end of the semester would pick the inventions they thought actually were monetarily viable and not do them in the public display and have private grading sessions for them so they wouldn't be publicly disclosed as you described.
You might want to do public disclosure, though, if you don't want a patent.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It does restrict anybody else from patent as well. Can you talk a little bit about notebooks?
I don't know what you mean about notebooks.
So
Oh, date and time. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, if you see yourself as an inventor, it is a very good habit to start actually writing down your things sequentially, no blank pages, or Xing out the pages with date and time. It's a little bit less important now because now we are in first to file rather than first to invent. Historically, if you could prove I thought of this idea on this date and it was before somebody else, then you would get the patent. But now it's whoever gets the application into the patent office first. There are a lot of caveats on that, and particularly with public disclosures, having documentation can sometimes be useful. The other part is, as part of the FDA approval process, you have to actually show the design process. And so showing the pathway of development of the idea actually for new devices is becoming part of the FDA approval process. So that's a much longer conversation about how to actually document all of that. In my opinion, it's a great reason to be working with engineers who have specific training on how to document the design process. But you can go a substantial way on your own. Just bear in mind, write things down, have a record of when different improvements in the idea happen.
Or email them to yourself on your university university account that gets archived forever and ever and ever and ever.
Other questions?
Yes, sir.
Comments on predictive algorithms. So let's say you're working with a company that you get the data from a smartphone app or something like that. And then you, as part of your research, have developed like a new prediction algorithm that would enable them to do something much better than what they're currently doing. Can you patent like sort of, I guess, a software code or a prediction algorithm?
Sometimes.
Yeah, right. I'm like, that's yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, and the other question that goes along with that is it a medical device? And it used to be the answer was software is not a medical device, and now broad categories of software becomes a medical device. This is not a legally binding statement, but if you can show that you have a process that ends in a definite conclusion, you can patent a process, but you can't patent the software itself. It would actually be copyright laws that applies to the software itself. But in some circumstances, algorithms can potentially be patented with a really good patent attorney, maybe.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that's where a lot of folks have gotten in trouble with even just apps because they feel like apps are become property, and but it's the actual the code actually belongs to the person who made who actually created the code of the app rather than the purpose of the app. So it can get a little complicated, but worthwhile discussion with a patent attorney. We thank you very much for your time. We hope you had a great rest of your meeting, and thanks for coming to see us in the last morning. Thanks.
And we're happy to hang out a little bit.